so that just kick that off again. So this really only applies for projects which are intending to be the owners of social rented housing and have access to Homes England grant. So if you happen to be doing another tenure like shared ownership, this wouldn't apply. You don't need to become a registered provider. So if your scheme has got rented homes in it that need grant subsidy in order to be affordable, then that's what this is aimed at, this talk. So just looking at, are you seeing part of the screen obscured by everybody's pictures, or can you see the whole screen? Can you see all the content?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Because
Content, the people should be down the side, Andy. It's probably your view.
yeah, okay. As long as it's just my view that's slightly impacted, that doesn't matter. So yeah, just a few examples of projects where people have actually self-developed, taken full responsibility for the project, and become registered providers because their projects have involved rented housing. So we've got Calder Valley in Yorkshire here, the Livenet Trust in Cumbria and Keswick in Cumbria, but there's many more around the country. These are just ones that I happen to know about. So first of all, this slide is all about, what's it like to actually take full responsibility. In the early days of community land trusts and community-led housing, there wasn't really much of an alternative. People had to sort of take a deep breath and take responsibility and self-develop, so that they were actually having to kind of virtually go on a crash course in development, learn how housing worked, and as a charity or a not-for-profit company, take responsibility for that. And then gradually there's been one or two other models that have emerged, which have made things easier for communities. But basically the trade-off is it's control versus workload, if you like. So if you were thinking about going it alone, there's plenty of reasons for doing that. If you're feeling like you've got the experience, you can handle project management, or you can buy in project management if you want to fill that skills gap. But lots of responsibility, lots of stuff to learn, and potentially fewer compromises because you're not dealing with another organization. So if you've got the time and the desire to actually take that on, it's a route which has been successful for lots of community groups, but it doesn't suit everybody. Some community groups are very keen to shape the vision of development and get certain outcomes, but they're less keen to actually take on the workload and the financial risk of developing a project, and that's where these other models may be relevant. So these are the kinds of factors that might be relevant for yourselves in terms of why you might want to consider a partnership development. And I think for me, it would be quite attractive if I was able to get pretty much the outcomes that I was looking for and do less work. Then I would want to look into what was possible through various different partnership mechanisms. So I think the other reason for talking through all of this is, of course, because the Manchester Hub is going to become a registered provider in order to provide these sorts of partnership arrangements. But meanwhile, up until that happens, we can think in terms of talking to existing housing associations that are out there. So it's about being realistic about your capacity. It's about having a think about what level of responsibility you want to take on, what's right for your group. It's about how best to handle workload, risk, and complexity. So it may be that you're quite comfortable to do that yourselves, or it may be you feel very attracted to the idea of a partner housing association handling some of that for you. So the registered provider process is quite involved and takes time, but there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to do it. But it may be attractive to think that, well, actually there's an option here where we don't need to do that, but we can still get pretty much the results that we were looking for. And also working with partners, there is the fact that they're always dealing with sites, and they'd be very much the kinds of organisations that would be able to flag up possibilities that they could work with on together with you. From the housing association point of view, some housing associations are more altruistic than others, I guess. It's also about timing, because a housing association might be interested in the fact you're actually trying to do something, and they respect that and they want to get behind you, but it might not be the right time for their organisation, depending on what their internal pressures and priorities are. But a lot of housing associations would be interested, and they are quite fascinated by community-led housing, and they see this as another way of getting a result. And there's lots of upsides for housing associations in terms of, you've got free volunteer time here, working with the community, getting people on side, exploring what the actual need is in a locality, in terms of knowledge of neighborhoods, or knowledge of the lie of the land, things like flooding, depending on where you are. Sometimes local knowledge can add to the value of what's known by agencies and so on. You've also, as a housing association, you've also got a lot of extra enabling capacity through things like the hubs. So that's another factor for them to consider. So that we can, as hubs, we can bring community groups to housing associations with the right kind of springboard for action. So we would do a lot of work with groups in terms of getting their governance sorted out, and clarifying what they were setting out to do, and getting them up to speed on technicalities and so on. There's the potential for better outcomes if you're working with a community rather than working independently from communities. In terms of talking about all the different factors that come into play, and there's potential specialist funding. This tends to come and go. We had a fantastic community-led housing fund until recently, and there's a smaller version of that that's been launched to follow up on it, and there's the potential to link into other funds such as venturesome pre-development money and so on. So that's very attractive to housing associations. And in the long term, if they're providing a development service for a project, they're going to earn fees from it. And if they're managing the houses, then they're going to earn revenue income from the houses, from the scheme. So first of all, looking at what we call the development lease model, and this is where the community organisation doesn't need to become a registered provider. This is where the housing association takes the greatest amount of responsibility, and the focus here is in the negotiations around the terms of the development lease. So the community's energy with legal support, expert legal support, we go into discussing the terms of the lease. So you start off with informal dialogue. You'd probably circulate a prospectus which sets out your aims and objectives. That would hopefully trigger some interest from a housing association. You can then move from informal discussions through to talking about heads of terms, where things get more formalized, and eventually the actual lease itself. And that's really where the community's energy is focused with this particular model. And so then it depends on the community being able to access land so that it can actually lease it. And that might happen by asset transfer or bought with grant assistance. And in the Southwest, the housing associations which are working on this model will sometimes actually buy that piece of land and then hand it to the community so that this lease mechanism can be brought to bear. So there are all sorts of different ways in which the community might already own a piece of land. So that's the key which unlocks this option, really, is the community at some point has got to get into the ownership of a piece of land. And then everything flows from that, with the housing association taking responsibility for accessing all the funding and finance, managing the build, and then managing the completed homes. So the community sets the scene, and the housing association does the hard work. And here's a few examples of, so in the southwest of England, this has been very successful and has been used very extensively. And we have a few examples in the northwest now, starting to emerge. And the most current one is the Lune Valley CLT one, a sizable scheme, 20 homes, and with South Lakes Housing Association as the partner. And that partnership, as with the others, has been very amicable and effective. There's the other model to consider is what we call the consortium model, and this can be where the housing association just gets hold of the grant to make the grant application process simpler for a community group. But the outcome of this model is that the community will actually end up running the scheme and owning the scheme. But it's a method whereby the risk of the actual development phase is handled by a housing association, or can be. So because the community group is going to own rented houses and manage them, it does need to become a registered provider, but the business of developing the scheme would be done by a housing association, or the community group could handle the development, but just ask the housing association to access the grant for them. But if you're going to ask them to access the grant, it seems sensible to consider getting them to actually manage the build as well, because that's the difficult bit which community groups are not familiar with. And then the community group ends up with a completed asset, which it can then manage, which is more straightforward than the construction phase. And if you wanted to, even though you had to become a registered provider, you could contract out the housing management to a more expensive, experienced registered provider. So examples of consortium schemes. This is one in London, where a housing association acquired a site and built out a scheme for the women's co-housing group, and rather than passing this in this particular example, because there are very few projects which are exactly the same as other projects. They all tend to vary slightly, but in this case, the housing association that did the construction phase then transferred the freehold to another smaller housing association, which owns the scheme, but it manages the scheme in cooperation with the client group, the women's co-housing group, and there'll be all sorts of other variations on that theme. So as I mentioned earlier, the partnership process, whatever you're thinking might be right for you, the typical process would look something like this, where you've actually done some training, got organized, got abreast of the various technical issues, so that you've got good foundations to then start discussions with housing associations. And the method which I've tended to use on behalf of groups or with groups is this idea of drawing together a prospectus, a document which tells people what you're about, why you've set up, what you're aiming to do, and what you're looking for from a prospective partner. So you know, having spent some time making this look good, there's some great examples out there, prospectuses that have been drawn up by community groups. You can then circulate that to housing associations that you think might be interested, which will hopefully trigger expressions of interest and perhaps lead to initially informal conversations, and then perhaps interviews where the housing association makes a pitch and you can ask each other questions and so on, and find out, get a feel for which one is going to make the most effort to deliver your particular aims and objectives, and has the most enthusiasm and so on. And then make a selection. Once you've made a selection of your partner, then you can have some more exact negotiations about how you're actually going to work together. And so these are the questions which were circulated ahead of this evening, and it might be interesting just really to have a think about these and perhaps discuss them. So, you know, does your project need to include rented homes? That it's an not obvious question. Can you develop them without Homes England subsidy? Generally speaking, it's pretty difficult to create affordability without Homes England grant. What are your long-term aims? If it's just one small scheme that you're thinking of doing, perhaps there's less of a driver for going through the process of becoming a registered provider. If you want to play a more long-term strategic role, going on to do other schemes, then there might be more justification for going to the trouble of becoming a registered provider yourselves. So, you know, what's the feel within your group? You know, have you talked about these things? Have you got a good feel for how much time people might have and how much enthusiasm they have, and the kinds of skills that might be around the table? You feel confident about handling risk and so on, if you were thinking of becoming a self-developing registered provider? What kinds of skills have you got around the table? Because it's interesting looking back at the earlier slides of two particular groups that did become registered providers. The first, the Livenet Community Trust, they actually had some project management skills around the table, and initially they wanted a housing association to project manage their scheme, but they, for various reasons, the housing associations weren't able to at that point in time, and so they actually took the job on themselves and did a very good job of it. But equally, the Keswick Community Housing Trust, they had all kinds of diverse skills, but not in project management. So they had a little bit of advice and guidance from a housing association, but interestingly, they actually grew into the project management side and did a really good job of it. But it's so it's a combination of factors really, which might gradually lead you to making a decision. And if you were thinking about committing to become a registered provider, as you'll see in the next session that we do, where we're looking at some more detailed documents, the advice from the regulator is that it's best not to apply, even for the preliminary stage, until you've actually got a live scheme, which has got it's been fully designed and offers of funding and finance in principle and so on, because that will speed up the time that it takes to go through the registration process. So it's thinking about this process in relation to your timetable. So is this a good point to get some feedback, questions, air issues, and so on? I'll hand over to the group for questions, really.
Well, Andy, I was thinking that there's a few people in the room who I know are sort of quite far down the line on their projects, and it might be nice if they just, maybe take a few minutes to just use the questions as a bit of an update to tell us where they're up to
Yeah.
just to get us going. Would that work?
Definitely, yeah.
Not going to name any names.
Well, it would be great if we did go around the group. For our point of view, it would be, or my point of view, it'd be interesting just to hear what people are doing, where they're at, and so on. Maybe we could do that. Who's willing to kick off?
Who's going to start? Bernadette,
yeah,
are you?
I know, sorry, Rachel, I was trying to unmute myself.
I was going to say, because I'm thinking you're from the people that I know in the group, I think Bernadette's probably the furthest down the line, so that might be a good place to kick off.
Oh, I'm going to dob Dave in. Me and Dave are about the same level, so so I'll dob him in as well. Yeah, so I suppose, shall I go down the questions? That's probably the easiest way of doing it, isn't it?
Yeah. What's the name of the group, Bernadette, please?
So we're Inspiring Housing Community Land Trust. So we like to be complicated. So we're complicated beasts. So we're actually Inspiring Communities Together is actually our charity, and then we've decided to go down this route of community-led housing. And so we've set up a community-led housing trust vehicle to be able to do that, but the two are interconnected. So Inspiring Communities Together, the charity, has a place on the board of Inspiring Housing. So just to make it more complicated, we have already submitted an application to become a registered provider, which was turned down. And I think what you say, Andy, about the fact of us not having a scheme actually at the right time meant that it was too complicated, and I think we tried to make ourselves too complicated, and so the registered provider was like, hang on, this doesn't make enough sense to me when I'm reading it on a piece of paper. So but what it did do was it gave us a whole list of things that we needed to do. So I suppose what I would say to people is, actually, if you think you're at a stage where you want to think about it, it's not too arduous to submit the preliminary, but you get really good feedback, and that helps you then to sort of progress and think about what you can do next. So it's another alternative to think about it.
So Bernadette, did they turn you down at the preliminary stage or the detailed stage?
No, preliminary stage.
Preliminary, right? Okay.
Yeah, but they gave really positive, really good feedback.
Oh, good.
Which was really helpful, and it comes written in a written form, so it's sort of you can create it into an action plan and start working through it, really. So since then we've actually probably progressed quite a lot. So we actually merged with another organization that actually owned 5 houses already. So we now own 5 houses. So we've done the legal transfer now. So our community-led housing now owns 5 properties. We're in a very fortunate position that we're working with Salford City Council on a site, and so they are doing the risk and acting as the Homes England bidder. So we won't have any risks up front, but we need to be in a position to be able to purchase the properties once they are built. So we're just at the stage of drawing up the plans, and so the plans should go to planning in the next few weeks. And that will be it's a site of 64 units, of which we will ultimately own 24 of them, and the council will own the remainder. So it's a shared site, it's an old school site. And then we've also got an option for 5 homes on a site that Salix Homes are developing. And so, and again, they will act as the Homes England bidder, and we will then just come in at the end and purchase the properties minus the grant. So we're in quite a fortunate position, really.
So you're
All our
you've found yourselves going through the consortium model, adopting this consortium model, where you don't do the development, but you end up with the assets.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, so we've been quite lucky that way. So all our properties will be rented, affordable rented. So, and obviously we do need Homes England subsidy, but we're in the fortunate position that the council and Salix Homes will be putting the bids in on our behalf. So they will get the grants, and then they will sort of offset that against the cost of the properties to us going forward, which Homes England are quite up for. So there's been lots of conversations with Homes England about how this works.
Great, really interesting.
So is it what's our long-term aim? I suppose we're not looking to be a large RSL, but we are very much about place and how we can support people in a place. That's what our model is all about. And so the idea of the model is that we deliver activities to support people within communities to improve their life chances, and the housing is the extension of that, so the people that live in them will also be able to access the wraparound support, whatever that may be. We're looking at homes for older people. We do a lot of work around older people, so lifetime homes for older people, plus homes for younger people, and how we might make that a cohabiting type arrangement as well, plus some family
Sounds
homes
like, I
to
mean,
support that.
as well as your social aims, it sounds like from what you've done already, you see yourselves as taking other opportunities and gradually increasing the number of schemes that you have.
Yeah, but only but they need to be in the right place. So you know, we're more interested in the place and so hence why the scheme with Salix, you know, that they've got the land of the council to build on a site that is based in a community that we've got a relationship with, and so the idea of being able to have some of those houses provides us with that support to connect with all the assets in that community. So it's sort of a model that has to work in that way as well. It's not just about having housing to provide homes for people. It's about where those homes are based, so that we can make sure people are embedded in that community.
Hmm.
So have we got an appetite for risk? Well, I suppose that the board have got an appetite for risk, but definitely managed risk. So we've been talking about this for quite a long time. Our charity has been trying to create a reserves and investment pot, so that we've got some financial funds behind us, which the charity will then lend to the Inspiring Housing. So again, the model is that lending to the charity, that so the charity gets money back, so the charity can then deliver its services. So you can see that how they support each other then. So we've already started having conversations with banks, and yeah, we're getting some positive noises that people would be interested to work with us to fund what we're looking for. So from our board, so we've got a lot of financial management support on our board. So we've got a lot of interest that way. I come from project management background. I used to work in a housing association, so I've got some knowledge of housing. So I wouldn't say we've got a strong board, but we've got a strong enough board to drive us at the moment. But we would definitely be looking to strengthen the board going forward. And so what timetable? Well, as I said, you know, the big scheme is due to go to planning any time now, and then yeah, then it's sort of, it'll go along the path of a developer's already been secured to do that element of the work. So it'll just all systems go, and probably in the next 2 years we'll have the housing.
And
Sounds easy when you say it like that.
yeah, so could you tell us a little bit about how you're going to approach the business of reapplying to become a registered provider?
So I'm working through, trying to work through anyway, the issues that they've addressed. So I suppose that from what you were saying as well, you know, the fact that we now own 5 houses, even though the houses at the moment are managed for on our behalf by Salix Homes, so a registered provider, but it makes it easier for me to be able to articulate why we want to become a registered provider, because we've got property. And I think that was the challenge, was that I was working towards getting these houses. I was working towards a scheme. So I think what we're looking at now is that we'll put what we've got into the application and probably not talk about the things that we haven't got, even though we know they're in the pipeline.
Yeah, I think what they've done is probably logical, because from the numbers that I've seen quoted, there were large numbers of groups of people who were applying, who were aspirational, and it didn't amount to anything. So they were taking up the time of the regulator in becoming registered providers, but they weren't actually delivering anything. So from their point of view, they want to have confidence that you are a group that has got really got something to deliver. And I think,
Yeah, I mean, we had memorandums of understanding from Salix and the council that went with the bid, but it just wasn't good enough for them. They wanted more.
Yeah. And have you been grappling with things like the lower rent test, that kind of thing, and allocations policies?
And yeah, I mean, I'd done an allocations policy, so that wasn't really a problem. And again, because we work so closely with the council, you know, they're really supportive in providing what we need, and the relationship that we have with Salix as well. So you know, so we get both of them provide us with sort of documents that we can then, if you like, pillage and make our own.
Excellent. That's very, very interesting, Bernadette. How about Dave? You've got something on the go.
Yeah, we're something very similar. We're part of the same consortium, Inspiring Communities, and so there are 5 sites being developed by Salford Council, and we have one of them. We're proposing, just going to planning this week or so, to build 45 units, 1, 2, 3, 4 bed properties in different, on a small site. Basically, it's quite a tight site, a former school site, and with some specific liabilities, I should say community assets, in the form of a vast sculpture that's going to be protected on the gable end of this former school. And it just adds to the cost of everything. But the cost is one of the things that bothers me, not the mechanics of getting involved in something that's completely outside our comfort zone as a charity dealing with employment and community learning, things of that nature. We're obviously very familiar with tenants of social landlords, since everybody we deal with, you know, lives in social housing virtually. So it's not exactly a new field, but.
So can you tell us what your organisation does, and a bit about your experience and the board and so on?
Well, it's a charity. We've been going for 20 years, and it has 3 or 4 strands. One of which is community learning, about 1,000 learners a year. It has employment related work, including job clubs and one-to-one support, and getting people into the construction industry directly, and getting people into work from prison. You know, there's a number of little projects, a number of relevant projects around all that. We also have an interest in things like community research. We do projects on community research involving people in community-led research projects. We was trying to do 1 or 2 of those a year. And we mainly focused originally around East Salford. We are the Broughton Trust. That's just one area within East Salford. But because of the nature of the kind of competitive nature of the work that we do now, i.e. working through tenders and contracts, we tend to provide services across the city where required, and we are very flexible. We can drop in anywhere. That's, you know, we're a responsive service that deals with the estates throughout Salford that need it most.
So
That's our background. We're interested because we're constantly working with people who have housing issues. We are constantly we have a well-proven IAG, i.e. individuals support system, if you like, information, advice, and guidance project. So we do spend a lot of time talking and listening to people. So we know the issues around housing, and let's be honest, if Salford Council hadn't invited us to get involved with this, really on the back of that last grant funding, I can't say that we would be where we are now. We wouldn't be where we are now. I can't say that. Let me be honest. We wouldn't be in this business. The council's very keen for some of the major community anchors, to show their colours and get involved with this. And I have to be quite honest, it's given so much support, unprecedented amount of support and risk taking, that it's made it a bit of an unreal situation. We've tagged behind, filling in bits of paper, doing applications, writing bits of intent, ambition, whatever. But basically, the council has done all the technical preparatory work. But we've been party to it. They've led, but we've been party to it, and right through to the point of design, appointing, the architects, appointing the builders, all that sort of stuff. We've been involved with. A lot of attention paid to the social impact, the social value, of all this. The 5 sites together, several hundred houses, and going on for 3 or 4 years. So there's quite a lot of opportunity for social value exercises in the middle of all that to make sure the community gets as much out of it as possible.
And will it be a similar model to Bernadette's model, where the council or another partner will be doing the development phase and then handing over so that you will manage the completed homes?
Yeah, that's the way it's slid. I mean, that may have been the inevitable end point all the way through, but I mean, when we were first involved and there was talk of grants and the community led housing grants and so on, it seemed like there might be more opportunity for us to take more responsibility. But as the financial equation has worked away from us, we're very much in the hands of the council. I'm not even too sure now, although I've gone through all the business of collecting all the evidence and information towards a Part 1 application. I'm beginning to wonder whether if the council's going to do all the liaison with Homes England, do we need to be a registered social provider? That's really the only reason, or the biggest single reason, that in my mind we were going down that route, because we need to draw in as much money as possible. And I have to say our scheme has gone up in cost by 50% over 15 months. What looked like a perfectly viable exercise when we started, it looks quite different now, 15 months later. And I think it puts us even more in the hands of the council, really, than what they can get out of Homes England. That's
a good point to actually raise, is the if you come across things like different pressure points that are bound to happen, in development, it's quite nice to have an experienced partner who's leading on that, who can reflect on it and see whether or not they can overcome obstacles like that. But your ambition is, or the aim now is for you to own the houses and manage the houses. That's the message I'm getting.
It is, and it's very much an extension of our our mission to
Yeah.
get people on a pathway, a pathway which to some degree improves the quality of their life, whether it's
That's the thing which you're most likely to deal with successfully. And it sounds fantastic to have a partnership where the difficult task of development is being handled by an enthusiastic partner. That sounds really good.
It's very good. It's been a real eye opener, to be honest. It's been a very good experience, taken a lot of time on everyone's part, but the council have been unflinching in their support, I have to say.
Yeah. So whether it's the council or a housing association, I was thinking in terms of housing associations because that's what I've come across. This is a great new variation which you're describing, but whoever the partner is, it's actually much more like the German model where the council actually assembles land and then gives a group an architect who actually is more than an architect. They're more like a kind of one-man housing association. They know how everything works, and the group just acts as a kind of they're the client, and so they shape the vision, and the architect does all the difficult stuff, and then the group moves in, and all their energy is saved for actually creating a community. So yeah, I think that's really interesting. Mark, how about your experience?
So far. Thanks for inviting me. Really appreciate it. Apologies for being a few minutes late as well. Quite different than the two examples that have been spoken about here. I've got so much respect for where they're up to. Bernadette and Dave seem to be working really hard and doing really well. And what we seem to be talking about are associations that are focused on accessing land with a view to new builds and the process that's involved in that, and the structure of partnership, or was it consortium that you said, Andy?
Yeah.
Consortium. That seemed to be those sort of models you were talking about. I'm part of and the chair of a campaign in Rochdale to save some existing social housing, 7 tower blocks, in fact, in the centre of Rochdale, for anybody that knows it. And just recently we have, after the local elections, we got into a very strong position with our allies on the council. We've got extremely strong support in the council for saving these blocks. Our housing association, Rochdale Borough Wide Housing Association, wants to knock down 4 of the blocks and start redeveloping. We would say gentrify the area and the town centre, when there's as we all know, there's a real need for social housing across the country, but never more so than in Rochdale. 7,000 people on our waiting list. So what my reason for being here tonight is really to pick your brains, everybody that's here, and see what direction we can go in and what we can pick out of the things that you're talking about that will help us. First of all, we're not in a position to apply for for a registered provider. We're not at that position yet, although we've got some really strong individuals to form a board. I made some notes here as Bernadette was talking, in truth, that the basics, I'm sure you would regard them as the basics of finance and project manager. Those are things that we do need to work on, but we have got fire safety, we've got mental health, we've got social housing scientist lecturer involved. So we've got some really strong people, but there are some basics there that are missing, which mean that we can't apply for status, housing provider status ourselves yet. So we're looking to form a partnership with the local council with a view to them, one way or another, taking over the blocks and then developing and doing the cyclical renewals that are needed and upgrading and retaining the blocks. That's where I'm up to. So hand on heart, I'm here to pick your brains, people, but thank you very much for inviting me.
Great. Well done, Mark.
Thank you.
Very interesting. Who can we pick on next?
Bob.
I'm just trying to read my chat at the moment. I'm trying to pick Bernadette's brains there about Salix, and let me just read it there. It's a fascinating stuff. It's really good. It's because I'm from LGBT Foundation in Manchester, and we were lucky to get some funding from Homes England's Community Housing Fund because Manchester City Council decided to develop the first LGBT extra care scheme in the city. And we got Homes England funding because we wanted to make sure that the community were at the heart of the scheme. It's not feasible or viable that the community will own any assets or will be, take any ownership of the extra care scheme. But that's why I'm here today and been talking to Tom and Rachel and Vicky and a couple of the enablers over the last year, because the LGBT Foundation's got other housing ambitions. And we've also been approached by a couple of private developers who are interested in, I don't know, I think maybe they've struggled with getting housing or getting planning agreement for some of their developments. So they've been approaching some charities, and we've been at the end of a couple of phone calls with them. So we've got these sort of opportunities. We've got a level of needs. LGBT Foundation run a helpline. They've been running since the 70s, and housing and homelessness is now becoming a major issue for our communities. And we look at sort of BME housing associations and thinking, well, maybe LGBT housing associations could be developed because we've got, domestic abuse issues, homelessness, rough sleepers, as well as the extra care scheme. We could be developing a range of different affordable housing options for our communities. So with these opportunities online and with the need there, we're looking at, well, how can we develop our own housing solutions? Maybe it's with the hub, because it's far too early days for us to be thinking about being a registered provider. However, when we've been speaking to Homes England, we've been getting very mixed messages. Some of them have even last year encouraged us to send in an application. So it's really interesting to hear today, that probably wasn't realistic because we've got nothing on the horizon. So it would have been too early for us to submit any application at that stage. But that would be our ambition as an organization. There's no housing expertise on the trustee boards of LGBT Foundation. I'm being brought in as a consultant to work with the extra care scheme. So our ambition would be to bring in more housing expertise, development expertise, especially. And that's what's been really useful, talking to the enablers, just try and, start thinking about some developments. We've been talking to Manchester City Council. We've been talking to the Greater Manchester Combined Authority and some housing providers. There's a strong appetite to meet the housing needs of LGBT people. And it would be great if we could put community housing at the heart of that. And it's been fascinating to hear, of Bernadette and Mark and Dave. But, maybe, if we can talk to some councils and some housing providers the way you're doing, and we can start thinking about joint ventures, and we could potentially get on the housing ladder. That's all we need, just to get a first step on there, and then we can start thinking about the further developments. So I'm just sort of scattergunning through these questions, but I think our long-term aim is that we would have a range of housing options, that we would have a pathway of housing options for our communities, for people who need emergency accommodation, right through to people in extra care, but also people who need that affordable housing. And if we can pull people together who can do co-housing models, then that's great. Just a range of options, that's what our ambition is. And if we can do it on our own, or if we can do it with the hub initially, then that's brilliant. But that's where we are at the moment.
Have you been in touch with the Pride of Place group in Leeds at all, Bob?
Yeah, we've been in touch with them, and there's a couple of other groups as well in London. There's now a new older lesbian co-housing group, and there's the Tonic group in London as well, that they have secured a loan from the Mayor of London to purchase 19 flats. So
Yeah.
we've created this sort of development group, and we're sort of learning from each other, sharing ideas and things.
Great.
And in fact, there's a meeting next week, I think, with some Liverpool group as well, to think about potential community-led homes in Liverpool. So there's lots of discussion and talk at the moment. It's how we move it into action and build up the partnerships with Bernadette and David.
Really good to do all that research. Groups are always going to vary in terms of what their ambitions are, and some will be focused on the outcomes, and others will want to actually roll their sleeves up and get involved in the process and so on. But the Pride of Place group have been very interesting to work with, because they established pretty quickly that they didn't want to do a crash course in development and actually have to do all the development themselves. But they wanted to have as much influence as possible. So they sort of presented themselves through a prospectus, which was a very good document, but very well presented prospectus, to housing associations through the council, and basically threw down a bit of a challenge or an invitation to say, we've actually got very clear ideas about, how we want to live together, and we want to have mixed income community, and we want to have young and old, and we're being very ambitious in terms of scale. They were talking about 70 houses, and the inclusion of community facilities and so on. And they were saying, we haven't got all the answers, but we would love to talk to a development partner who would see this as something exciting to work with. And I believe that they are now just starting to talk to a housing association that has shown some interest. That's just their particular approach, but it's the outcomes which everybody really wants. It's then the question, how do you get there? And I think really the main thing from this evening is that some groups are, as we've just discovered, have already kind of found themselves working in partnerships. So that there are a range of options, and that's really the important message to get across, is that there isn't just one way of doing things. Rachel.
That's brilliant,
just
Andy. Thank
thinking,
you very much.
I was thinking it was quite interesting, because I think it's really, we've had the two Salford groups, and then we've had Bob who's currently working in Manchester, and I think that you mentioned, Bob or Andy, did you mention the one in London, the LGBT one that's been financed? So I found out last week at the National Hubs meeting that the London hub is basically providing finance from the GLA, the combined London authorities, they're providing at-risk finance to finance community building, and GMCA isn't doing that. So maybe I was really interested in that, about how, look at the ones that are successful that we're talking about, they've all got local authority or combined authority backing.
I think that's a very important point, and I think something that I didn't really stress as much as I should have done when I was running through those slides is that apart from all the other considerations, that one big issue just at the moment, which would be solved by working in partnership, is the whole question of funding. And the London hub just happens to still have community housing fund is still live, whereas for the rest of the country it was closed. It didn't last very long, but it was fantastic whilst it was there, and it actually, it's access to money that makes things happen, and it sparked off, catalyzed a huge number different groups forming, and that, you know, like in Leeds, we've been getting a large number of groups all up to speed so that they were ready to go into the development phase, and then the fund closed. Whereas London, you've still got that money available. But the great thing about considering partnerships, and some of you just found yourselves in partnerships which do this already, which is fantastic, but is that it does solve both the pre-development funding and the development funding issue. You know, so if you did happen to be a group that was thinking about being a registered provider and self-developing, it would be pretty difficult to do that, really, because the community-led housing fund isn't there anymore, and you know, there's some pretty modest other funds that can offer some of the cost, but not all of it. You know, so working in partnership through a housing association or the council, in some way or other, potentially can actually unlock the funding situation. It's just one less thing for you to actually have to, one less nut to crack. Is there anybody that we haven't heard from that would like to say anything about what they're trying to do and so on? Debbie, who's Debbie? Debbie can't see at the moment.
I don't think we can hear Debbie either.
Not to worry.
So, is it Sophia or Sophia? Or am I saying that all wrong? Sophia, you're from Bury Affordable Housing.
Hi, yes, can you
Hi.
hear me? Yes, so I am, yes, from Very Affordable Housing. I don't think I'll be able to answer some of the questions for the group. We're very early in our stages of development. There's 6 families in the group, we're all local, we all live in Bury. And we sort of started at the end of 2019, and we sort of, you know, started working towards looking for land in the beginning of 2020. We had a meeting with Tom Hopkins. I think it was going really well, and then obviously with COVID, everything just stopped, and we've been quite inactive for many months. Not really progressing anywhere, and we're now sort of trying to get back on track. We've got some plots of land in Bury that we are interested in. We're trying to liaise with Bury Council, but we're nowhere near incorporation or sort of looking at the routes of being a registered provider. So really early, and just here sort of to pick everyone's, you know, your brain and your experience, and see if anything that could work for ourselves.
One of the things that, one of the thoughts you've just triggered there is the impact of COVID. One of the things that that Leeds Community Homes did in answer to the challenge of COVID was to actually set up online workshops. So for new groups who were coming to all of this fresh and needed to actually have enabling support to refine the vision, get organized, get incorporated, familiarize themselves with all the technical ins and outs of housing. So we ran online workshops for that with resources, which meant that to a large extent, the impact of COVID didn't really stop those groups from building the foundations for action. So, you know, in that situation, you know, that could be reproduced, you know, for any group really.
No, that sounds really great. I think it was sort of the problem with our group is none of us really have the skills that would help us to sort of move forward. So we are lacking the experience and the skills, and we sort of just when unsure, we used to meet face to face, and when the COVID happened, we sort of just said, oh, let's go and, you know, we'll just wait and see what happens. And then it sort of just progressed from there. We just sort of stayed really inactive. But we are like I say, we are looking to resume our meetings and sort of follow up on our queries with Berry Council and see where they are, because one of the things about Berry that they do own quite a bit of land.
Great. Yeah.
You know, compared to other local authorities that might not have as much land, Berry does have quite a bit of land, but it's just sort of building that communication with them.
Well, I think what my feeling would be for a group like yourselves, which is just setting out, is make the most of the presence of the hub whilst it's there. You know, the hub has got a whole bunch of people. You could be just having, you know, gentle kind of introductory conversations. You could be getting some assistance from enablers to kind of clarify what you might be doing and start to understand the kind of housing landscape and how things work and what might work for you. You know, so especially if you're talking to the council and the council owns land, if you can build up your understanding of the different options that might be available to you, that's going to, you know, help. And I'm sure the enablers would also be able to sort of be in on some of those discussions and help you present a really kind of clear message to the council so that you come across convincingly.
And that sounds great. I'll pass the message to the rest of the group, and we'll definitely be in touch.
Messaged you, Sophia, to see yeah, can we meet up for a catch up? Yeah, and let's get some stuff moving again. Yeah,
absolutely. We've got a groups meeting this coming Monday, and yeah, absolutely, we can we'll get in touch. That'll be great. Thanks, Rachel.
Any other
Debbie said she's back on. Debbie, can you hear us? Can we hear you? Oh, Debbie, where have you gone? I don't know. Maggie, do you want to say where you're up to? No.
I'm just too busy fighting the council at the moment to be up to anything.
Okay. Debbie, are you there? Oh, Debbie's asked a question. Is there somebody that can set up as a registered provider and do all the bureaucracy paperwork? Yes, that's what the hub is planning to do.
You can get help to do the application forms, but if you read the guidance, and we'll be covering this in the next workshop, really the process does require that whoever is applying is really hands-on, fully understands the process and the you know, the responsibilities. So if you are thinking about becoming a registered provider, yes, you can get help, but that's not intended to be a substitute for you understanding the process and leading the process.
Well, Andy, do you want to tell us a bit, because we've got 15 minutes left. I've been invaded by a very molting cat. So do you want to tell us a bit about what the next week's workshop is? And then
yeah. I'm going to be sending through
Bob's got his hand raised first.
Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Andy a question about partnerships, really, and maybe the others could answer, but I'm just wondering, what do the local authorities and housing associations get out of this? A partnership with a CLT, or, I mean, what financial benefit do they get, or is it all social value and for their reputation? And also, you mentioned in the partnerships about housing associations and now councils, but would or have there been any partnerships between community-led housing groups and private developers?
They have, but the only one that springs to mind that I'm familiar with is it didn't involve affordable housing, and of course that's fine because community-led housing isn't all about affordable housing, but it was a co-housing project. It was quite interesting. You may have heard of it, Marmalade Lane. And that was a really neat model because I think there were 40 families who all had the they provided a ready-made client group, so there were a bunch of customers ready to go to pay the money over for the houses. They didn't want to do the development, so they brought in a developer, a small developer called Town, and they got the designs worked up with the group and with the architect. And they then brought in the constructor, Trivselhus, the Swedish company, and they actually bankrolled the project. So because there was enough units, Trivselhus just built everything without charging until the point where the homes were finished. And at that point, Town and Trivselhus sold all the houses, got all their money back, and left behind a beautiful co-housing scheme. So it was a very neat model. But in terms of next week, Rachel, the idea is for those who can stand it, I'm going to circulate some slightly more dense documents, which are about summarizing. There's one document which summarizes the pros and cons of becoming a registered provider. So why you might consider it and why you might be cautious about it and look for alternatives. There's a summary of the actual application process for anybody who hasn't actually looked at this before, just to give you an idea of what the regulator's looking for. And then there's a bit more, there's another sheet which is to do with the going through these partnership options again, which explains, the kind of qualities of each one. So it's expanding a little bit on the slides that we've gone through this evening. And then there's a kind of just a kind of a risk comparison sheet, which sort of shows you, the effect of, taking on responsibility yourselves compared to where a partnership partner is doing things for you. So I think there'll be about four documents. You don't have to read them all, but if you flick through them, it'll help to get more value out of the session. And then, of course, once we've gone through it in the session, probably, those documents, you already have them. You'll be able to refer to them anytime you want to, and you might want to come back to us with questions at some point in the future.
So most people, I know, I think Dave said he's segued off. Is that what he said? Are most people able to come next week to carry it on? So because the way that the training was organised that Andy had done is that it, definitely leads into next week. And then we've got those things to think about in between. I mean, for me, I find it easier to process in sort of smaller chunks. That's what I've been finding with the whole RP experience. I've really struggled with people speaking about registered provider route application who already sort of know everything. That's what I feel like. So I found it really useful tonight to see the examples that you've put, Andy, see what other people are doing. Then I feel like I can go away, or first of all finish my holiday, but then think about some of those connections, what we might learn, and then come back with maybe some new ideas next week as well. So Andy, are you going to send me those forms? I'll send them out tomorrow. Actually, I'll Bob, if you send me them, Andy, because I've got the round robin, I'll send them out to everybody. with the link again for next Thursday. But if anybody wants to, in fact, I tell you what, guys, shall we, is everyone happy if I do a CC rather than a BC? And then we could even use a reply all if we wanted. I mean, people could ignore it if they want to. If you want to be blind copied, just message me now and go, I don't want to speak to these people. Yeah, and then we'll start a bit of a chat maybe before next week. So, Andy, is there anything else for tonight?
That's it from my side, unless there's any other thoughts or questions. But I'd encourage everybody, you know, if there are particular points that you either want to make us aware of or want to ask in terms of questions or just general awareness raising, then it'd be really good for Rachel to get that kind of feedback.
Yeah, okay. I'm just aware that yeah, because so I'll kick some stuff off, yeah, tomorrow, see what people want to bring up next week, and then I'm probably not back online till Tuesday. So yeah, you can keep an eye on everyone. Thank you. Can you tell I want to go out for dinner now?
Me
I
too.
feel like my sunburn's sort of reached its peak. And now I'm feeling a little bit like going to a Turkish restaurant. So shall we say goodbye?
Yeah, thanks a million. That was brilliant.
Yep.
Yep.
Brilliant. Thanks. See you
Enjoy.
next week, and I'll email in between. Bye.
Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you, Rachel. Enjoy.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.